go ahead and get started. And welcome to today's conversation on Scott Allard's new book, Places in Need, The Changing Geography of Poverty. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. And this year, the Taubman Center is focusing on three themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, and the price of security. And Scott's work speaks very nicely to these themes with his close look at the rise of suburban poverty over the last 25 years and the challenges that suburban communities are having as they try to address the rising poverty. He writes, "There are more poor people in the suburbs of the largest American metropolitan areas than in the cities. But despite the growth of suburban poverty, he finds," and I quote again, "suburban organizations struggle to overcome local perception gaps about poverty problems, which translate into limited local political will and capacity to act." So I'm delighted that Scott is with us here tonight to discuss these findings and the mechanisms at work. Scott is the Daniel J. Evans Endowed Professor of Social Policy at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. He is an expert on social policy, urban policy, and inequality. He is also the co-director of the Family Self-Sufficiency Data Center at the University of Chicago and is a non-residential senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we were very fortunate to have him as a faculty member here at Brown between 2003 and 2008. Welcome back, Scott. We miss you. Come more often.
I think I left my hair here.
We're pleased that Professor Margaret Weir and Professor Michael White are joining us to discuss Scott's book tonight. Unfortunately, Professor Roberto Gonzales from Harvard University is unable to join us tonight. We look forward to having Professor Gonzales join us at another time soon. Margaret is the Wilson Professor of International and Public Affairs and Political Science here at Brown University. She's an expert in social policy, urban policy, and politics. She has published extensively on social safety nets, regionalism, and poverty in the new metropolis. Thanks for coming, Margaret. Michael White is the Robert E. Turner Distinguished Professor of Population Studies here at Brown. He's also a professor of sociology and the director of the Initiative in Spatial Structures in the Social Sciences. He has published extensively on urban residential segregation, on rural-urban migration in developing societies, and on contemporary international migration and immigrant assimilation. Thank you, Michael. So our time together is going to unfold in the following way. Scott will begin by giving us a brief overview of his book, and then Margaret and Michael will follow with about 15 minutes of comments each, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. And then I would invite you all to join us in the reception afterwards, and I'm sure Scott would like you to buy his book, which will be for sale out there as well. So do you now please join me in very warmly welcoming Scott and Margaret and Michael.
Thanks for that awesome introduction. I am really humbled to be here. I want to thank Susan for organizing this, and Margaret and Mike for sitting on the panel today. Susan and I have been friends for a long time, and our conversations have really shaped my intellectual development. And Mike and Margaret, both as individuals and scholars, have been great mentors to me over time, and I really a lot of what I do is a reflection of things that I've learned from them, and so I appreciate that. I want to thank the staff at Taubman, Matt and Michelle, who helped me today and helped organize this. And it's really great being back here. Brown was this book emerged actually as an idea while I was here, and Brown was a really supportive place, and John and S4 were huge in that early development, and the Taubman Center and Political Science. So it's such a treat to be back here. I left for the University of Chicago from here in 2008, and I'm a poverty scholar, and I used to think because I grew up in a low-income household that made me certified to talk about poverty problems in America. And then I worked in the South Side of Chicago for many years, and I was always aware of white male privilege and what that meant. I thought I was, at least. But I think that experience living on the South Side and working on the South Side made me more aware of things that I didn't always understand or appreciate, and it made me aware that there were privileges I experienced that I'm not even aware of, if that makes sense. I think research and commentary that informs policy is a form of power and privilege. And what I want you to hear today is a story about how poverty's changed, how it challenges our stereotypes about poverty, often racial stereotypes, pernicious racial stereotypes about poverty that undermine how we support communities in need of all kinds, of all contexts. And the goal, hopefully, of this work and the conversation is to provide evidence and narratives that ensure that we can build safety nets and opportunities that help, that are more responsive to the needs of low-income Americans, regardless of where they live or regardless of their racial or ethnic identity. And so that's kind of an overriding goal and important for me to say at the outset. As the book outlines, I start out by talking about what the conventional spatial discourse around poverty in America, and the kind of common way as citizens, as scholars, as journalists, we think about poverty as an urban problem, an urban phenomenon. And we think of suburbs ideally as the American dream, places of opportunity, places where people work and have happy lives and homes and children that go to school and are successful and all these kind of tropes of the American dream. And you see this reflected in our research. This is a chart, it's a heuristic. It's not super scientific. It's JSTOR article counts. The top line is the number of articles that have the word urban, city, inner city, a variety of things, and poverty in the same article. And you can see there's thousands of them. It's consistent with the focus of scholars on urban poverty, concentrated poverty, racially segregated poverty in cities, problems that have been persistent in the post-war era. And at the bottom, you see the count of articles that actually don't talk about suburban poverty, but actually just have the word suburb and poverty, or suburban and poverty in the same article. Not on the same page, not on the same paragraph, but just anywhere in the text. And you just see that even from this count, even scholarship doesn't really talk about poverty outside of cities very much. And our news stories, our news coverage is very much the same way. This is the same exercise looking at newspaper, magazine articles over time. You see that, again, we in our, whether it's our scholarship or in our media coverage, we associate poverty with the urban. Moreover, we associate it with persons of color. So part of the spatial discourse around poverty in America is a conversation about urban poverty that we, as a popular, in our popular mind, associate with people of color. And suburban opportunity is something that we associate with white affluence or white homogeneity. As I showed you, I think it informs scholarship, it guides our media, it underlies our popular impressions of poverty, and it shapes our policy rhetoric, debate, and tools. And the presidential campaign in 2016 highlights this, I think, very well, where we had a candidate that ran around talking about burned out urban centers, violent places where people of color live, and perpetuated stereotypes. That's not to say that there isn't racially segregated and concentrated poverty in cities. It's just that it's not that simple or straightforward. In the book, I argue that this discourse, in addition to being a false narrative demographically, which I'll show you in a second, it promotes biased understandings of poverty. It fosters notions of poverty, that poverty problems are for others, whether they're people who look different than us or who live in different places. It contributes to the othering of poverty. It overlooks key trends and questions. And ultimately, the fact that we link place and race and poverty in our popular mindset undermines support for the safety net, undermines local support for local solutions in particular. And so I'll give you a few data points and then we'll open up. And actually the conversation here is perfect. I'm continuing to write from this material, and so the learning that I will do with you today will inform future work. This is a table that, part of a chart that kind of sits at the center of the book. It's the trend in the number of poor people in the largest 100 metropolitan areas from 1990 on the left to 2014 on the right. And what you see is that in 2014, the dark line are suburbs, and the purple line is our cities. And you see that there are 4 million more poor people in the suburbs of our largest metros in 2014 and in cities. What you also see is that the tipping point happens differently in different municipalities or different metro areas. In Seattle, where I live now, the tipping point happened sometime in the 70s. In Chicago, it happened sometime closer to the Great Recession. But the tipping point happens at some point in many metro areas in recent years, where the number of poor people in suburbs exceeds the number in cities. But if we go back to 1990, and again, in our largest 100 metro areas, we see that there are almost as many poor people in suburbs of our largest metros as in cities themselves. And you know, if we think about where we were in intellectual history, this was a moment when we were reading William Julius Wilson and talking about the urban underclass. And we were thinking about patterns of segregation in cities, all very important issues, all pressing policy concerns. But suburban poverty was a blind spot in that moment as well. We think of the trend in suburban poverty often as being something that's relatively new or recent, but as I argue in the book, and I think this table kind of highlights, it's a relatively new phenomenon. Now, oftentimes we'll think that poverty in suburbs is a function of mobility or migration, people from the city moving out, whether it's due to housing development changes or housing vouchers, historic patterns of migration, and that's true to some degree. But the rate of change in the number of poor people in our suburbs is 3 times the population growth rate. And so that means to me, and I think evidence bears this out, that it's not just about migration. This is about people in suburbs becoming poor in place. And in the book, I argue that this reflects changes in the labor market, changes in labor market opportunity, changes in work earnings for those without advanced training, as well as forces of immigration, or the reality of immigration and migration from cities. But I think the story here is largely economic. It's important to note that the fact that we have more poor people in suburbs hasn't eliminated poverty in cities, right? Poverty problems in cities at this point in time in this table are as high or as significant as they've ever been. Poverty rates are near historic highs in 2014, and even though we made progress, are still well above what we would think of as a historical level. And poverty rates remain twice as high in cities as in suburbs. If we were to focus only on the increase in poverty in cities in this time period, we'd have problems, more problems than we could deal with. So one of the things that's important to convey is even though poverty has increased in suburbs, this hasn't resulted or corresponded to a decrease in poverty in cities. And similarly, poverty increases have occurred similarly in suburban areas across race and ethnic groups. This isn't a story about Hispanic Americans or Hispanic immigrants to the U.S. only, or Black Americans. It's a story about all race and ethnic groups experiencing greater need, greater hardship, greater poverty in suburban America. And one of the reasons I focus on counts here is we often think about poverty rates, and that's an important metric for considering the issue. But when you start to think about numbers, you start to think about the realities that community-based organizations and the safety net have to confront. When a school district experiences an increase in the number of kids with special needs, or on free and reduced lunch, where it increases by 500 kids in a short period of time, that's a pretty big change for a school district. Or when a food pantry sees the number of people seeking help double or triple in a short window of time, that's significant. And poverty rates often gloss over that and gloss over the challenges that the safety net is confronted with. And so I spend time in the book talking about poverty rates. I talk about concentrated poverty, deep poverty. The trends are very similar, but I think the numerical count matters. So I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, but in the book I talk about how the safety net, we could think about it as being kind of core public assistance programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, SNAP or food stamps, Medicaid, TANF welfare cash assistance, often targeted at single-parent families. These programs total roughly about $200 billion a year. But alongside that are a localized network of community-based nonprofits that deliver probably closer to, I would guess, probably about $100 billion a year of assistance to low-income households, whether it's through emergency assistance, housing, employment services, behavioral health, publicly funded, but primarily delivered through these kind of local community-based nonprofits. And what we end up having is then kind of 2 safety nets. You have a federally funded, regulated safety net that often does vary by place, but some programs vary more by place than others, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then we have a local safety net, often composed of community-based nonprofits, that provides a lot of critical assistance to help families who fall through the cracks of eligibility or have temporary losses of earnings or work. These are the programs that are really critical in a work-first safety net environment which we exist in, where there's expectations that low-income families will work to qualify for benefits. In the book, I argue that different programs are going to be differently responsive to the geography of poverty, and I'll focus here on the Earned Income Tax Credit and SNAP. These are two federally funded programs. The Earned Income Tax Credit provides refunds and credits to low-income households and is one of our most effective anti-poverty programs, and SNAP provides food assistance to low-income families as well. These are federally financed and funded. That's the same thing, it turns out. Federally regulated. And so you'll get the same benefit or the same program in different places. This is a much more localized system and reflects local community political will, local interests, local capacity. And so I just have a couple slides to motivate this point. The safety net response of the EITC is fairly common across geography. So this is the median EITC refund per filer across urban, suburban, and rural counties in blue. So I threw in rural here because it's important to make sure we're thinking about the safety net across different geographic contexts at times. And even though the bars look different, you'll notice that the average refund is about the same, a little over $2,100, almost $2,200 per filer. The EITC is really responsive to the changing geography of low-wage work and poverty. Caseloads increase almost with a 1-to-1 ratio to increases in poverty. And the same is true for SNAP or food stamps. And these are scatter plots. Here I just have urban counties on the left and suburban counties on the right. And this is a scatter plot that shows the percentage change in caseload on the vertical axis to the percentage change in the number of people near or below the poverty level on the bottom axis. And this is a tightly clumped, dense cloud of points in each case.
I have no idea.
Yes, it's funny, at the University of Chicago, I would get hassled all the time like that. I didn't realize I had to have like, Siri come and do that. I suspect that Siri was speaking for a lot of us then. So there's a line through these cloud of points, and again, the correlation between SNAP caseload increases and changes in need are very tight and consistent across geography. It doesn't really matter where you live. SNAP is responsive to rising poverty and rising need. Other public programs are less responsive, but I want to turn, just with the time I have, to talk about social services because they're such a critical element of our safety net and often overlooked not only by scholars but by policymakers. So this chart here shows you nonprofit human service expenditures, the median nonprofit human service expenditure per low-income person, again defined as 150% of federal poverty. And I show you in 2000, 2010, just because I had the data to do that. And what you see is that in urban counties, we spend about 8 times as much as we do in suburban counties. It's true in 2000 and 2010. If you think about this, this is what we have for all human services for a person. So this is food pantries, employment, behavioral health. Anybody who works in human services would tell you that $800 is not enough to do anything for anyone, let alone $106 per person, which you have in suburbs, or in rural communities, very little. In fact, about a quarter of all rural communities have virtually no human service providers at all, kind of underscoring the challenges. Our human service safety net has been almost exclusively concentrated in cities, and if you work in cities, you don't have enough resources, but there's a real gap in capacity in suburbs where poverty has been rising rapidly, and where poverty rates in many communities are approaching what we might think of as city or urban, or kind of poverty rates that would be consistent with urban settings or stereotypes about urban settings. And the other thing to note is that the social service safety net is not responsive to changes in poverty. This is the same kind of chart where I have the percentage change in nonprofit social service expenditures and then changes in poverty on the bottom. And these are essentially kind of a random scattering of points. Poverty goes up, sometimes your county does more, sometimes your county does less. Poverty goes down, sometimes your county spends more, sometimes it spends less. There's no real relationship between changes in need and human service provision in urban or suburban counties. And this is shocking and alarming because this is the glue that holds the safety net together. These are the programs, whether they're in community-based nonprofits or faith-based organizations, that people trust and turn to for help. And it matters that we don't have a system that's responsive to the shifting geography of poverty. Why is that the case? I can, in perhaps Q&A will allow me to give you some stories. Part of it is that there's limited capacity, both public and private capacity in suburbs. Poverty's never been perceived to be a suburban problem. We don't have the capacity or resources or the organizations in place. And that matters. And so maybe if we come together in 10 more years, we'll have a different story, and likely we will. And in fact, I was talking to Margaret and Susan earlier, and you can see the needle moving in some communities. I was in a community in Chicago a few weeks ago that's really seen an uptick in their nonprofit human service capacity over the last decade. There are issues of fragmentation and distance in suburban communities that are problematic. If you're a food bank executive director and you're in a city, you deal with the city. But if you're a food bank executive director and you're operating in a suburban region, you might deal with 300 municipalities and 12 counties and 27 school districts. It's a much more difficult enterprise to coordinate. Suburbs have limited economies of scale, which means some programs are just not feasible to deliver or to deliver in an accessible manner. And there's a lot of NIMBYism and competitive pressures. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is how a school district in one of my study sites was having a food pantry for low-income families, and the families lined up outside the door early in the morning before they opened the food pantry, and they lined around the block. And a county council member came and said to the principal, what are we doing here? Why do we have all these poor people here? This is telling people the wrong story about our community. We don't want people to think that we have poverty problems. And the principal's like, these are the parents of our children in our school. This isn't like we didn't ship these people in. These are our neighbors. And he just didn't want to see it. And he said, shut it down. We don't want to do this anymore. There's this perception that if you have a poverty problem, it's going to be hard to be competitive for economic opportunity, or maybe house prices will take a hit. And there's a lot of NIMBYism. That's tied in many ways to racial prejudice and discrimination and anti-immigrant sentiment. And I have a lot of examples in the book that kind of tie to this point. But there's one example that stands out where a provider, I went to visit this human service organization, and on the front of the building they had posters, and they looked like kind of guys like me with hair, like white men, white women, getting help with computer training and job search assistance. And then you go in and everything is in Spanish language. And they're serving primarily ESL population. And I said to the executive director, wow, your outward face is really different than what's happening inside. And she said, if we actually were outward facing with our client population, we probably would get defunded by the county. We might have picketers and protesters. We couldn't do our work except on the down low like this. That kind of is pretty powerful and striking, and not an unusual or isolated incident. And then because we don't think of poverty as a suburban reality, people think of the problems as being for other people to take care of. And one of the realities is when you go into suburban communities, people will talk about the poverty problems in their community sometimes. And when they do, they often will say, well, that urban part of our suburban community over there. And by that, they're saying these aren't people that are part of us. We're not responsible for them. And when you think about it, suburbs were created to be places of exclusion. And it makes sense at some level that they don't see poverty problems or don't see inclusion as being something that is known to them. I'm happy to talk about this. I want to give time to Susan, Mike, and Margaret. A couple key things here. One, it's important for us. This work's important because we need to challenge the stereotypes about poverty and its causes and change the dynamic, change the conversation, change the dialogue. We need to think about ways to have new voices and new questions in this space, that we're asking questions about poverty in place that are relevant to the communities today and not the way that we think communities are composed, or maybe the history of how we think about this. We need to support public programs. This is not a time to cut federal funding for anti-poverty programs. In fact, it's a time to expand our programs and create greater support for programs that work across different kinds of geographic contexts. We need to prepare the next generation of leaders, and the next generation of indigenous leaders who understand how important it is to flip scripts, or who have to flip scripts as they work with policymakers and their home communities. We need to support them to give them the toolkit that they need, but also we need to support them so they can do the work that they know is important for their communities, and not presume that we have a sense from our positions that we know what's best. And then finally, we need to choose a shared fate. Ultimately, if we don't see poverty as a problem that affects all people in all communities, all our friends, relatives, and families, we won't create a safety net that works for anybody in any place. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be able to comment on Scott's really fantastic new book. I found found this book to be a major contribution to understanding where low-income people live in metro America, but also why it matters where people live. And so in my comments, I want to highlight and raise questions about the two major parts of the book. So the first thing is, and one of the central contributions of the book is that it provides a really in-depth and precise look at suburban poverty. We know that since 2006 or is it 2000, more low-income people live in the suburbs and the city. And especially during the recession, there were a lot of news articles about that it's not the Ozzie and Harriet suburbs. I bet a lot of you don't know who Ozzie and Harriet are. But that's like an old TV show about some, white middle-class suburbs. But Scott's book, Places in Needs, takes us a lot further than previous work has. And it does so in a variety of ways. And so I want to give you a sense of what those are, what I took away. So one of them is that poverty is not just growing in inner suburbs. So people often think, well, it's just the suburb is just like overflowing from the city. It's not, throughout. But his is this careful, he's measured in many different ways. It's super sophisticated work. And he shows that it is throughout the metropolitan area and throughout the suburbs. It's on the far reaches of the suburbs. And so it is not something that's just right next to the city. It's spread throughout suburban areas. I'm going to say a little more about suburban poverty, but I also really want to emphasize that one thing I think you do really well is to also emphasize we can't lose sight of the fact that urban poverty continues to be an enormous problem. And recognizing the fact that suburban poverty exists, we have to hold two ideas in our mind, that urban poverty continues to be an enormous issue even as suburban poverty has grown. So I think, unlike a lot of other work, especially the journalistic stuff, you do an excellent job of keeping that together. Scott emphasizes that suburban poverty stems from the same sources as urban poverty. It's not like there's so much of a kind of discourse about culture of poverty in cities, and it must be different in suburbs, and kind of a racialized vision of poverty in cities. And I think one of the things he really emphasizes is that these issues around labor force participation, education, what kind of income jobs provide, these are the sources of poverty in cities, these are the sources of poverty in suburbs. Another finding that I found really interesting, and I have really not seen it before I read your book, is that there is concentrated poverty in suburban America. Ever since William Julius Wilson wrote The Truly Disadvantaged, came out in 1988, people have focused on the problem of concentrated poverty in city. Now, I'll raise a question about this, but Scott measuring poverty as 20% poverty population in a census tract shows that concentrated poverty is growing in suburban areas, and also that it is racially identified, so that Blacks and Latinos in the suburbs, by 2014, a majority of Blacks and Latinos in suburbs are living in concentrated poverty. It's a little over 50%. So I found that to be a real eye-opener about suburban poverty. And so let me now just raise a couple of questions about the kind of picture and the map that you've presented in this book. So I do have a question about concentrated poverty in the suburbs versus concentrated poverty in the city. So the traditional way that people measure concentrated poverty in cities is with a 40% threshold, that 40% of the people or more in a census tract are poor. And Scott measures it as a 20% threshold, in part because the 40% threshold barely exists in the suburban areas. So I'd like to have a little conversation about changing the measure from from 20% to from 40% to 20%. And I mean, does that suggest, I mean, what are the differences there? Because some of the arguments that Wilson made about concentrated poverty is that you get, people don't know anyone who's held a job. They don't have those kind of loose ties that help you move ahead. 20%, yeah, you can see that it's problems, but is it qualitatively different from that 40% threshold that you still see in cities and are more rare in a suburban context? The second question I would raise is, does it even make sense to talk about suburban poverty? And that is in part because you told me to be interesting. Yeah. In part because these places are so diverse. And, I mean, in some ways it makes sense to talk about suburban poverty because now we have, there's so many typologies trying to make sense of suburban poverty that your mind will explode trying to wrap your head around what all these different typologies mean. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that suburban poverty, it covers this range of places, and it's sort of, artificially defined by the census that something's a suburb and something's not a suburb. So Lowell, Mass. is counted as a suburb, as is Gwinnett County, which is a huge, pretty wealthy county outside of Atlanta, but actually has more poverty than the city of Atlanta just because it is so big. So I guess I just would raise questions about, this label that we stick over all these very, very different places. A third question that I would ask, and this I would love to hear your thoughts about it, is that, especially during the recession when there was a lot of news stories about suburban poverty, there was a sense of, oh, these are new people. And then there's like the old hands and they're saying, oh, here's how you do it. Here's how you go to the food bank. Here's how you figure it out. What is your sense, and the data may not be available yet, but what is your sense about recovery from in the city versus in suburbs, recovery from the recession? Poverty grew everywhere during the recession, and it has begun to go down. Although you point out, quite rightly, that it's still pretty high because we have this problem of low wages. But I wonder what your thought is and what your research has said about, is there any reason to think that the recovery will be longer lasting or will be better in the suburbs than in the city? So that's one piece, critical piece of the book. The other piece that is really fantastic is this portrayal of what this social services are and what this social safety net is. And I want to just stand back for a second and highlight the importance of social services in the American welfare state. So since 1996, which is a critical time that we passed what is called welfare reform, which basically made it nearly impossible to get cash assistance in the United States, and certainly not to get it for any period of time. More money has gone into services, and the idea is that the services will make people job ready. And so we have a work-oriented welfare state. Really the only thing you can get are food stamps, right, or SNAP benefits, unless you're working. So these services play this critical role in making sure that people are going to be able to work if they lose their housing, if they need help on the side, if they need connection to a job. And what Scott says, and he has a great term for it, is that we have a few of these programs that are national, but they're really, except for SNAP, they're very oriented towards work. But when it comes to these social services, we don't have a national system. And in the book, he calls it a network of local safety nets. And I think it's a really great way to think about it. It's a network of local safety nets, and they really, really vary because they're so bottom up in the way that they're created. And they were not nearly as responsive to rising need during the recession as programs like SNAP, which was really the most responsive because a lot of people were out of work and they couldn't get benefits from the EITC. But as he points out in the book, these programs rely on local capacity, political will, and initiative. So this is particularly true in the suburbs because the suburbs, in a sense, many suburbs, not entirely true, and your work points this out, that poverty has always existed in suburbs, and historians have written more and more about working class suburbs, and that the image of Ozzie and Harriet never was an appropriate way to talk about suburbs. But for many suburbs, these organizations have to be created from scratch. They have to be created anew. And so this is a huge issue. And one of the things he does, I think, really well is to highlight what some of the barriers are to creating this new kind of capacity. And he talks about competitive local pressure. So suburbs are competing against one another. Suburbs don't want to be known as the place where a lot of low-income people live. And a lot of suburbs, like cities, would like to put a lot of their money into economic development. And as I was looking over the book, I mean, I read it as soon as it came out, but as I was looking over the book, I was thinking about something I had just read. Cobb County, a suburban county of Atlanta, where there is growing poverty population, just put $400 million of public money into moving the Braves Stadium to Cobb County. I don't know why it had to leave the city. And then they cut back on funding nonprofits. And they recently said they're going to cut back on funding libraries. So these kind of competitive pressures there are very strong. And the difference is in a city, you may have people mobilized and they can fight against it. They don't always win, but they can fight against it. In the suburbs, people are not organized to fight against this. He also points out NIMBYism as a huge issue. And so, again, I think one of the things that's different in cities and suburbs is just the political weakness of advocates in suburbs. They lack the tools for political mobilization, and they lack the political connections that many kind of organizations have in cities. So I think, you know, I really appreciate the picture of the difficulties and the importance of these of this safety net and the difficulties in building it. I would also say the lack of a suburban safety net also creates burdens on cities, and it's important to remember that, because if people can't find the services they need in cities, they often will go to suburbs, I mean, they'll often go into the city, so you see this kind of suburban free riding on the city. So let me just, I'm going to just stop with a few short questions. And so one of them is, well, does the weak landscape of organizations in the suburbs create opportunities? Because one of the big problems that you have in places where there's lots of nonprofits is there are a lot of turf battles, and you have people fighting against another, and you have a lot of weak nonprofits. So could the absence of organizations paradoxically create more opportunities? I can't help but ask this, you know, how will the new work requirements that many states are planning to put on Medicaid and perhaps other social services affect these organizations? What kind of new burdens will it place on them? And I'll just, one more, and then I'll conclude. Obama's portrait was unveiled today. I don't know if people saw it. It's got all these ivies around it. And he said in his talk is that America's strength doesn't unfold from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. What is your response to him in light of your research? So I'll just totally really conclude, I'm getting the hook here, with a broader thought about just thinking about comparative policy in the welfare state. You know, a variety of thinkers have talked about, transforming European welfare states into social investment states. Like, don't just spend money keeping people idle, unemployed, but have an investment in people. And I think, in some ways that the idea of a social investment state, it hasn't made much headway in the United States, but it is consistent with American values, which prize work, prize independence, prize initiative and self-sufficiency. But these big holes in our safety net are one of the hugest obstacles for us to move towards a kind of a social investment state. So I'll close by congratulating you and thank you for writing such an illuminating book that scholars of poverty will be coming back to again and again to try to understand the challenge that poverty poses in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Michael?
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to comment on this book. And let me say that I'll echo some of the things you just heard from Margaret. But I want to go back to an origin story. Scott and Susan mentioned that Scott had some halcyon days here in Providence, Rhode Island. And I happened to be here at that very same time. And for one of your original HUD grants, where, as you said, some of the ideas were emerging, I had a chance to talk to you a number of times about research methods and about the underlying ideas. So it's very exciting for me to see this long-term research agenda manifest itself in really a very comprehensive treatment of the geography of poverty. I want to, in my remarks, talk about a few key contributions of the book, underscoring, I think, some things that you already know or you've just heard, and then turn to some background thoughts and maybe some questions to raise. Maybe one or two would even be challenging and worth answering. So for those of you who have yet to pick up the book, of course I encourage you to do that right away. And what I think you'll find is first, echoing Scott's own remarks and Margaret's comments, one of the most overarching important themes of the book is a framing that moves us away from a simplistic and outworn binary of cities are poor and suburbs are affluent, or sites of opportunity, which I think was on your slide, reminding us throughout that suburbs are themselves very diverse places and are often places of disadvantage as well. Secondly, the book really documents and analyzes, and now I'm going to quote from the text, the rise of suburban poverty amidst the persistence of poverty in central cities. So there's a place to really understand the breadth, the geographic and nationwide breadth of poverty. And a third item is that I think uncommon to some of the writing, or much of the writing on poverty, there's a real interrogation or discussion with the providers. You interview people, you actually talk to them, you quote from them in the book. And so there's a back and forth there that reflects the view of the people in some of these social service agencies that I think is not often there in the social science work that so often analyzes and quotes statistics on poverty. You've actually talked to the people who've tried to provide public services and use that to inform some of your own policy recommendations. I think that's a great strength of the book. And lastly, I'll recommend that the book has an extensive amount of documentation. It's wonderfully footnoted and referenced. I would never say there's too much documentation. So there's a wonderful storehouse of knowledge there. So those are some things that I'd just like to say at the outset that I think really encourage anyone to take a look at the book. The most general comment I want to make before I turn to some specific ones is to think about an issue in the policy realm in which a pendulum swings back and forth over the years, maybe over the decades, between the issue of people and the issue of places, or aid to people and aid to places. And I won't go quite as far back as Margaret did, but I brought along something from ancient history here. This that I'm holding up is a pamphlet or a book called Urban America in the 80s, 1980s that is, Perspectives and Prospects. And it's a report of the President's Commission on a National Agenda for the 80s, and specifically within that report on the panel of policies and prospects for metropolitan and non-metropolitan America. That was also known as the McGill Report. The individual who headed up that particular panel was Mr. McGill, president of Columbia University, and he chaired from 1979 onward Jimmy Carter's Presidential Commission for a National Agenda. The reason I bring this up is you'll see the pendulum going back and forth here, and I'm going to quote a couple of things from the McGill Report. Accordingly, the purpose and orientation of a, quote, national urban policy should be reconsidered. There are no national urban problems, only an endless variety of local ones. A few pages later, the McGill Report goes on to say, people-oriented national social policies that aim to aid people directly wherever they may live should be accorded priority over place-oriented national urban policies that attempt to aid people indirectly by aiding places directly. So I use that as an illustration of the fact that at that moment in time, reflecting one swing in the pendulum, at least of some people who were gathered for that report, that aid to people, moving away from aid to places was the way to organize things. We've seen over the course of the Great Society up to the present time, other versions that were at other ends of the pendulum, community development block grants, model cities, empowerment zones that were focused around place-oriented policies, stadiums that were supposed to generate economic development, even as they seemed to generate the circumstances that would have strained the budgets and moved things out of social services. So there is this back and forth movement. And I'm going to ask Scott at the end to say a little bit more, and I'm going to push him to where he is. As I read the book, and I concentrated specifically on the chapter on the geography of poverty, it's an excellent chapter, and echoing a little bit of what those of you in the room heard from Scott himself a few minutes ago, SNAP, or food stamps, and EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, are seen as highly responsive to changing geography of poverty, partly because they are directed towards individuals, wherever they are. TANF and other such programs, temporary assistance to needy families, the former welfare program, which have a lot of local discretion, are less responsive in the book's treatment, at least since 2000, and get a less favorable review. There's positive comments in the book about Medicaid and CHIP, the Children's Health Program, but also in the book, economic development zones, the kinds of things I was mentioning a moment ago, are seen as having little direct economic impact. So as one puts that together and then looks to the policy conclusions in the book, one sees a text that suggests strengthening SNAP, strengthening EITC, which many policy scholars would agree with, improving TANF responsiveness, and then a section which is entitled Strengthening Local Safety Nets. And so my first big question for our distinguished guest and author is, should we in fact try to bypass the local safety net, a la McGill and the panel from 1980, and aid people directly? When do we need to have place-based policy versus person-based policy that bypasses places? Obviously, we want to make people better off who are disadvantaged in society. I think there's often, however, a debate about how we get to where we want to be through the geography or bypassing the geography. So that's my largest question for you. Then I want to make a few smaller scale comments. I really like the idea of concentrating on suburbs here and opening up the Pandora's box, if you will, of suburban disenchantment and disadvantage. And I want to suggest some further thinking about political geography versus social geography, or jurisdictional geography versus ecological geography, if you will. And what one sees as one looks around the United States anyway is great variation in the fraction of the metropolitan population that's captured by the largest central city in the region. I know You know this, anybody up here knows this, and most of you in the room know this. So Chicago and Los Angeles are featured prominently in the book, and about a third of the metropolitan population, depending how you count, is in those places. But if one goes to Boston and takes some recent statistics, about 14% of the metropolitan population is in the city of Boston. And just as Margaret was saying a moment ago, a lot of those inner suburbs and some of those not so inner suburbs are some of the disadvantaged areas. So how do we think about geography that way? If we go to Oklahoma City, just to pull another one out of the hat, almost half of the population of the metropolitan area is captured by Oklahoma City itself. So I would like to see you respond a little bit to this issue of how we think about working in this environment where place matters so much, but the coverage varies so significantly from metropolitan area or from region to region. Secondly, I'd like to touch again on an area that you yourself mentioned in your comments, Scott, and that's this issue of the shifting bases of residential concentration or segregation, and the issue of race and ethnicity versus class. For a long time, social scientists focused pretty much preponderantly on racial and ethnic segregation. The last couple decades, people have looked a lot more at class segregation and found that that was substantial and, in some sense, increasing. And then a number of people have looked at the intersection between race and class, including our own colleague here at Brown, John Logan, who's with us today, and John Iceland, Glenn Fireball, Lincoln Quillian have all looked at these sorts of things. John, for instance, writes, lower income whites live in neighborhoods with a lower poverty rate than affluent Hispanics and blacks in a recent report of a few years ago. Those remarks are quite similar to some other things one finds in the literature about this. So another question for you is, how does one think about these policy issues and delivering policy when you have this intersection of race and class, or ethnicity and class, particularly in a concern now in a world where there's increasing awareness of and growing relevance of income disparities and class disparities in the U.S., and in a world where there's public discourse about racialization. How does one think about the delivery of services? What have you learned about how we should go forward there, particularly maybe with these community-based operators? And my last comment is really a suggestion for the next decade or two. Since we maybe helped launch in a small way some of the thoughts in places in need here, maybe I can help, and our discussion can help launch some next steps for you, Scott. What might you have to say to us about how to unpack the dynamics of geography and income disparity and poverty? The book gives us brief mentions of the program called Moving to Opportunity. It's cited in there. It seems to get a positive review from you from what's in there. You make mention of Raj Chetty's work and his colleagues on opportunity. And Chetty and colleagues argue that one way to address this problem, this generalized problem of concentrated poverty, is to provide subsidized housing vouchers. A number of people have suggested that. They write later on in the same document, one must also find methods of improving neighborhood environments in areas that currently generate low levels of mobility. So they've tried to look at opportunity unfolding over time and mobility over time, and have Chetty and others, Sharkey, among the sociologists writing in Stuck in Place, have raised a lot of concerns about how the geography of origin influences where you wind up. So I'd like to have you comment on, Scott, is what else would you have us think about with regard to your concerns about the geography of place and the delivery of services as we think about the impact of geography on people's long-term economic mobility? Mm-hmm. Thanks very much for the book.
Thank you. Well, our time has evaporated, and so, Scott, we will, of course, be continuing our conversation out in the reception. Scott, would you like to say a few things, and then I'm sure there are lots of questions here in the audience.
Yeah. So let me just say a couple things. First, thank you for the thoughtful comments. Thank you for coming and participating in this. I just really appreciate it. It's too bad Roberto was unable to make it. He's got this amazing book called Lives in Limbo, which is about what he calls Generation 1.5, which are kind of kids who are the dreamers, essentially, the kids who are the children of immigrants who came here undocumented, and how they, as they mature into adulthood, the realization that they're undocumented changes their transition to adulthood, and it's a terribly important piece of research, and Roberto's thoughts would have been great for all of us. And you know, if you're going to buy a book today, you should buy his book. And what he would talk about with regard to immigration and isolation, discrimination, would echo the conversations that I have in mind, but with a deeper resonance. A couple thoughts. One, this is a mixed methods book. I didn't actually do a very good job of setting that up. I actually look at a lot of census data, is what you saw, but I spent time in Chicago, Los Angeles, and DC interviewing hundreds of human service providers and spending thousands of hours in these communities, volunteering in suburban food banks and other food pantries in Chicago to kind of get a feel for this. And actually, I owe them a debt of thanks. They gave me a lot of time for this. Let's see. Let me actually, I think there's all kinds of important questions that both Margaret and Mike raised. I think the new work requirements for Medicaid are a complete disaster, to Margaret's question, and I feel like I need to take every opportunity to say that. Medicaid for working age adults supports mostly behavioral health and mental health services, and those are the barriers that are keeping people from working, and if you take away their coverage, you will basically confine them to a hard existence where not only is work hard, but there are no avenues for getting help, and you will destabilize the safety nets in their communities that are reliant on those funds to help underwrite other services for people who do not qualify for Medicaid. It is one of the worst-minded policy decisions of this week by this administration. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know. Let me talk. I think a lot of things that Margaret talked about, I think will echo in Mike's comment about kind of people aid versus place aid. And I won't do justice because I want to get to questions here, but hopefully at the Q&A conversation outside we can do this. I think I grapple with the kind of person aid, place aid dilemma, and I think the reality is a lot of our place level initiatives or interventions don't work very well. They're expensive and they don't actually lead to a lot of change. I think that means there's room, I think, for this generation of scholars and entrepreneurs to come up with better housing and transportation solutions and other place-based solutions that might work better than tax write-offs for companies or incentives to hire individuals. The reality is that those programs were created in a context when we thought people were working in cities or we're working close to home, and actually those realities aren't true anymore. And so I think we need to actually have better ideas there. The thing I spent time worrying about in this book is the place level variation in person-based aid and how the person-based safety net can be very inconsistent from one place to another. And a lot of the recommendations I make are designed to strengthen local safety net's ability to deliver person-based aid. Although I have a lot of concerns about person-based aid in many ways because it places responsibility for someone's poverty on themselves as opposed to other structural factors, but we can talk more about that. There's a lot of variation in what suburbs are, as Margaret talked about. There's a lot of variations in how suburbs and cities are composed within metros. It's actually what makes talking about these issues very complicated because you spend time talking about one metro or one city or suburb dynamic and you've talked about one, and it could be a very different story in other places. The hardest parts of the country to actually kind of think about this analytically are Boston and New York because they're composed uniquely geographically. They're older cities. They have older suburbs that once were suburbs but now feel like urban settings, and it's difficult to grapple with that. I'm happy to talk more about that. And I think I told Eric today, the thing that was hardest when I revised the data for the book to reflect post-Great Recession census data was there was this increase in concentration of people of color in high-poverty neighborhoods and suburbs. That didn't happen. That wasn't quite like that prior to the Great Recession. That's a post-recession greater reality. And it was hard for me to kind of, that's a tough finding for all kinds of reasons, but it underscores how we're replicating discriminatory practices in suburbs. And I have one anecdote for that. I was in a community where they did an audit study of housing. They had people from the community development office went around and tried to rent apartments, kind of like Diva Pager's work about looking for jobs, or John Yinger talks about audit studies, and there's other people who've done this. And they found it wasn't, you know, gold standard experimental design stuff, but they found evidence that the testers of color were not rented to and not treated the same as the white potential renters. And they wrote a report, and the community went berserk. The county commission said, we aren't racist. Look, we have a mayor of color in our community who was, it's true, they did, and in that huge suburban region. And then they fired the person who commissioned the study. And it's never been shown the light of day. I got, you know, the report itself got sent to me by my contacts on the ground. But it just goes to show the extent to which we are in denial, not only about poverty, but also about the degree to which racial discrimination exists. And it is swiftly moving in suburban communities to isolate people. And one of the things Roberto would talk about more effectively than I could, is the isolation and segregation that immigrants, and particularly Hispanic immigrants, face in our suburban communities, in our urban communities as well. So with that, maybe open it up to others, and maybe we can. I'm happy to be a network time filler to answer other questions if I can. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Atlanta, and something that people have been talking about really recently, since like only 10% of the metro area actually lives in the city, is like regional support, like for transportation and stuff. But there's a lot of concern, since like Atlanta's a Democratic city, so everything's controlled by Democrats right now. If you try to make it regional, it'll be controlled by Republicans. Does anyone have anything to say to that?
You describe a true political geography there. Margaret, you've spent time in Atlanta, haven't you?
Right. I mean, you know, the idea, the kind of fantasy of regional government has been around for about 100 years. And I think the chances that we will really, and it gets rediscovered every sort of 35 years. Like, I know the answer is regionalism. But there's so many political obstacles to regionalism that I don't think it's a danger. You know what I think is really interesting about Atlanta is that you have all these suburbs that sort of started as white flight suburbs that are now very diverse. And many of those suburbs wanted nothing to do with public transportation, the idea that you would extend MARTA out in any way. They always voted against, always racialized, like we don't want to allow blacks to come out here. Now that one of the suburban counties is predominantly African American, Clayton County, they voted to extend MARTA there. So that when I think about regionalism, I think more about how new people in different places may open possibilities that seemed foreclosed before, rather than thinking about regional government, which the political obstacles are too high.
I think there's room to coordinate some activities across smaller suburban regions, and I think you need kind of, I can't call them quarterbacks in the book, which I'm borrowing someone else's term, but my dad was a sportscaster, so I do that. I think there's opportunity to kind of think about how you can bring people together to do work. I was talking to a couple school districts in South King County outside of Seattle about how they could work together to kind of think about ways to smooth the school transitions that homeless children have, because they move between the school districts with fluidity. They could solve that by working together to kind of ensure that there's ways for the kids to have school continuity, even if they don't have housing continuity, and then maybe work to provide housing continuity. I think your point also, and Margaret and I talked about this earlier today, when you look at suburban areas, the diversity of the population is not reflected in representation in most of the political or charitable institutions. And so part of the reason why you see that disparity is that there are the economic marginalization and the social marginalization that many communities of color experience is also political marginalization. And so I think one of the challenges for those of us concerned with social justice issues is to try to find ways to bring new voices into elected offices and elected positions and to get involved in a variety of ways to make that happen. If we improve representation, I think we will improve local commitments to a variety of things and not just regional solutions to poverty. You can get a microphone, Kyle.
Cool. Okay. Hi. Thank you all for your talk and all your passion and good questions. I guess my question for you is sort of talking about that framing and like looking at binaries. Have you thought of other framings of metro areas beyond urban and suburban? So particularly one that's on my mind is sort of like favored quarter of the city and unfavored. So looking at DC, which I know really well, or Chicago, you can see that there's a lot of consistency between urban and suburban areas on the east side of DC, which is majority low income, people of color, and western side of the city, which is majority white or Asian, and a lot of economic development. And you see that whether companies are looking to be in suburbs or in urban areas, they end up choosing the west side of the city. And they can choose urban or suburban, but they're up on the west side of the city, right? And public transit is better on the west side of the city. It's worse on the east side of the city. I'm in Chicago, same with north and south. So I guess, how does looking at the suburban, looking at that urban-suburban lens flip when you look at sort of like favored quarter or unfavored quarter, and how can we address that, right? Because I feel like that's sort of, it's not all suburbs are grading in poverty, right? It's certain suburbs, and those tend to be on certain parts of the city that are near like low-income parts of the city. So I guess how do we address like that issue?
Yeah, well first, I should have had a map. I was trying to limit my comments, but then I spoke for like way too long anyway. I have maps that would show actually that the increase in poverty is happening everywhere. It's happening in Arlington, Alexandria, in Prince William County. It's happening in Prince George's County and in Bethesda. It's happening everywhere in DC Metro, and same in Chicago. It is true. There's a lot of diversity, though, between how it emerges and the causal factors behind it. I think economic changes are the driving factor in most places, but immigration will be a more acute reality where you have a lot of working poor immigrant families. But then you have other communities where migration from the city is a more prominent factor. It's hard to kind of come up with a typology. I think we tend to think of many suburbs as being advantaged places because maybe they spend more on schools, there's more affluence, maybe better housing or whatever, but there's also a lot of suburbs that have disadvantages, and I think how suburbs react or respond to the problems around them is a function of that. And so you can think about counties or municipalities that don't have strong political institutions or don't have wealth or sources of wealth to tap into. And a lot of that affects their response. I think also the footprint of suburbs matters too. So inner tier suburbs tend to be smaller footprints, and that changes the economies of scale calculations that you might have, or the kind of opportunities you have to develop better solutions. But I think what's hard is again, there's so much diversity, there's so much variation in suburbs, more so than in cities in many ways. It's hard to actually come up with kind of a typology that I felt good about that would kind of capture the differences that you described. And so what I try to do is say it's really varied, and here are some examples of how it is. But I think throughout all of it, there are certain threads that stand out. Economic change is driving this. Racial segregation is a factor here. The returns to education matter that have happened in our labor market. And then there just aren't in any suburban community nearly enough local resources dedicated to doing this. And the solution isn't going to be from reallocating money from cities, because cities have problems that are still historic in scope, and we're not going to solve problems by trying to reallocate money from cities. We have to come up with new dollars and new efforts. I'm happy to talk more about those specific places outside if you want. Those are good questions.
Let's just take a couple more and then go get snacks.
Snacks.
Hi, thank you so much for your book. So my question is, what is the political party affiliation of the suburban folks who are poor? And because I hear, to your point about support services, right? So is there a link between their SES and advocacy for more resources, or is there some type of discrepancy, ideology with their economic situation?
So this is an area where there's a ton of opportunity to do better thinking, and I'd be open to Margaret's thought about these issues. I think in many suburbs that I've spent time in, you know, as was stated by the first question, that there's a lot of more conservative governance or party affiliation, Republican Party affiliation. I don't want to presume that if you involve, I don't want to presume the partisan change of greater political involvement and mobilization. So if we engage and mobilize individuals who are currently left out of conversations, I don't want to presume that they are automatically Democratic or Republican. What I know is that there'll be voice for their community for the issues that they care about. There'll be representation for their needs. There'll be less paternalism from folks who think they know what's best. And I think that's ultimately what matters. There's a lot of space, though, to think about how the changes in the geography of poverty and the changes in the safety net or the lack of responsiveness in the safety net have political consequences. I don't know if you want to say something about that. We talk about that. My hope would be that we would have institutions that were responsive and receptive regardless of party affiliation, but that might be a cop-out answer. I'm happy to talk more with you afterwards.
I would just say one thing, and it doesn't exactly relate to party affiliation, but it does have to do with political representation. I think one pattern that you see is that you may see more representation of lower income people and people of color in suburbs that are poorer and less in suburbs that are well off. So then you have a problem that you can get political representation in places that have fewer resources, but it's harder to get political representation in the places that may have more disposable resources. And I don't know how that maps on to political parties. But the other thing I think that Scott's book highlights is that one important political factor is that these nonprofits also act as advocates. And if they're not there, then it's really hard in these places that may not be well politically mobilized or may not, be organized politically in the way cities are. It's hard for that voice to get out. And that's a point that you feature in the book.
Yeah. It's a good question.
Last question.
I think this probably varies a lot, but I was wondering to what extent the suburban poor are able to use the resources available in urban areas, and also possibly to what extent policymakers think they can and kind of say, look what's going on in the city, we don't need something here as well. So
a lot of eligibility for safety net programs is geographically shaped or determined. So for SNAP or Medicaid, you'd go to a county office to process your paperwork, and that's how benefits would be distributed. And actually, so one of the, I don't know if you noticed it, but when I talk about the demography questions, I use tracts and neighborhoods and things like that. When I talk about the safety net, I use counties as a unit of analysis because that's the relevant unit for safety net programs. And actually, urban counties have a lot of suburbs in them, and so there's some odd kind of smoothing that happens there. And so you might be better off if you're a suburb in an urban county. So if you're in Cook County, you might be better off than if you're outside of Cook County because you qualify for more programs there. So that's one piece. Most cities do very little by themselves, and so big cities have some programs and things, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the state-funded or federally funded programs. Folks will go a long way to get help if they can. And sometimes they'll go far away to get help because they don't want to get help in their immediate community. But I think the bigger challenges in suburbs are kind of navigating the transportation networks, the long commutes where you're juggling work, childcare, and those things really do affect access and take up. I think one of the biggest challenges that providers face is not seeing people who don't show up or who attrite from programs as assuming that they don't want to be there or they don't need it, because most of the time it's actually not about that, and yet they infer, they didn't come, so they must not want the program, so we're going to knock them off. Well, it's pretty hard to get around on the bus, particularly kind of suburb to suburb bus commutes, if you don't have access to reliable transportation. I think the other thing is that a lot of nonprofits won't serve people outside of geographic catchment areas. Those get defined. One of the organizations I spent a lot of time with outside of Chicago, the demand was so great for them in this particular suburb, they had to dramatically constrict their footprint, and that was a hard decision that they faced. And I think that they grappled with it for a long time, but their volunteers started quitting because they just couldn't handle the caseload flows. So that would be a couple thoughts on that piece.
Well, let's continue our conversation out in the foyer of the Watson Institute. Thank you, Margaret.